ብዙ እርዳታ ሰጥተዋል። ኃይለ ሥላሴ መንግስት ከፍተኛ እርዳታ ሰጥተዋል። ማንዴላ ራሳቸው እዚህ መጥተው ነው የሰለጠኑት ያኔ እና ብዙ እነዚህ የነፃ አውጪ ድርጅቶች የሚባሉ ሁሉ የአፍሪካ ህብረት መድረክ እንዲያገኙ በተባበሩት መንግስታት መድረክ እንዲያገኙ ብዙ ጥረት ተደርጓል። በደርግን ዘመን በአፍሪካ ጉዳይ ላይ ብዙ ማዋላዳ ስራ ተሰርቷል። አሁን ትልቁ የሶቪየት ህብረት ዕዳ የነበረብን $7 ቢሊዮን ደቡብ ሱዳንን ነፃ ለማውጣት በሚደረገው ትግል ደርግ 80,000 ወታደር የደቡብ ሱዳን ያሰለጠነው። ዚምባብዌ ከአፓርታይድ እንድትወጣ 25,000 ወታደር እዚህ አዋሽ አርባ ነው ሰልጥኖ የሄደው በኢትዮጵያ አየር መንገድ እና ብዙ አስተዋጽኦ ነበረን። ግን አሁን ያለን አስተዋጽኦ ምንድን ነው ለሚለው ጥያቄ አንደኛው ኢንተሌክቹዋል አስተዋጽኦ ነው። ሪሊ ፓን አፍሪካኒዝም ምንድን ነው? አፍሪካ የምትባል አህጉር አንድ ናት ወይ? ምክንያቱም ብዙ የሚያሁን እነዚህ ፍራንኮፎን ለብቻቸው ናቸው። ደቡብ አፍሪካ ሳደክ ካንትሪስ የሚባሉ ለብቻቸው ናቸው። እነዚህ መጥቀው የወጡ ሀገሮች እንደነ ሞሪሸስ አይነት ያውም አውሮፓንን እያሉ ነው ያሉት። ኖርዝ አፍሪካ አሁን ሞሮኮ፣ አልጄሪያ ብንወስድ እነሱ እንዳሁም በተባበሩት መንግስታትም በዓለም ባንክም በአይኤምኤፍም የአፍሪካ ሪጅን ተብሎ አይቆጠሩም። ሚድል ኢስት ተብሎ ለብቻቸው ወጥተዋል። ከነ ሌባኖን ጋራ ከነ ተርኪ ጋራ ከነ ጋራ እና እንደዚህ አይነት ዩናይትድ ፍሮንት ለማምጣት ትልቁ ኤፈርት የሚያስፈልገው በኢትዮጵያ በኩል ነው። ምክንያቱም አፍሪካ ህብረት አልቻለም። አፍሪካ ህብረት 98% ያለው ጥሪት ከእርዳታ ሰጪዎች የሚያገኘው ነው፣ ከዩናይትድ ስቴትስ እና ከአውሮፓ ህብረት። የአፍሪካ መንግስታት አምነውበት እንኳን ያለባቸውን ክፍያ መዋጮ አይከፍሉም። የአባልነት መዋጮ አፍሪካ ህብረት ሰዎቹ የሚመረጡት እዛ ሊቀመንበሩ እኔ 2 ተርም አገልግያለሁ የጸረ ሙስና ቦርድ ሊቀመንበር ሆኜ የአፍሪካ ህብረት እና እዛ ሁልጊዜ የሚታየው ያኔ ፕሮፌሽናል ቲም ያስፈልጋል ተብሎ በሄድ ኦፍ ስቴቶች ስለተወሰነ ነበር እኛ የገባነው እዛ። ሌላው ግን በሙሉ የአፍሪካ መንግስታት ዘመድ አዝማድ ባለስልጣኖች የነበሩ ናቸው። ፎረን ሚኒስትሮች የነበሩ ናቸው መጥተው እዚህ የሚቀመጡት እና አንዱ ኢኮኖሚስት መጥቶ የኤንቫይሮንመንት ክፍል ኃላፊ ይሆናል። አስቸጋሪ የሆነ ስራውን መስራት የማይችል በአመት 2 ተሰብስበው ውሳኔ ያስተላልፋሉ። ወደ 700 የሚሆኑ ውሳኔዎች መሬት ላይ አልወረዱም እስካሁን። ለምሳሌ ሳይለንሲንግ ዘ ጋንስ ባይ 2020 የሚል ነበራቸው። አፍሪካ ውስጥ ምንም ጥይት አይተኮስም ከዛሬ 3 ዓመት በፊት ማለት ነው። እሱ ስላልተቻለ ወደ 2030 ዞሮታል ነው እና የሚወስኑትን ውሳኔ እንኳን መተግበር የማይችሉ ናቸው። ስለዚህ የኢትዮጵያ ሮል ትልቅ ሮል አለ። አንደኛ በእኛ ውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትር በኩል የአፍሪካ ዴስክ የሚባል እንዳሁን ባንዶ ፕሬዚደንት ሳህለወርቅ ነበር የሚመሩት። የአፍሪካ ዴስክ አምባሳደር ሆኖ እውቀት ያላቸው ትልቅ ቲም ያስፈልገናል። ይህንን ለማድረግ ምርምርም ያስፈልገዋል እኮ ከአፍሪካ ጋር የሚያገናኘን ምንድን ነው? ብዙ አፍሪካ ሀገሮች እኔ ናይጄሪያ ትዝ ይለኛል አንድ ጊዜ ንግግር ሳደርግ እንደዚህ ወጥቼ እናንተ ራሳችሁ እንደ አፍሪካ አትቆጥሩም እኮ ኢትዮጵያውያን አለ። ለምን አልኩት። አፄ ኃይለ ሥላሴ አፍሪካዊ አይደለሁም ብለዋል ኒውዮርክ በሰጡት መግለጫ አለ። አፄ ኃይለ ሥላሴን ኒውዮርክ ሄደው ትልቅ ጉብኝት ሲያደርጉ ህዝብ ወጥቶ ሆ ብሎ ሲቀበላቸው አንዱ ጋዜጠኛ ዲዩ ኮንሲደር ዩርሰልፍ ኒገር ብሏቸዋል። ጃንሆይ አምኖት ኒገር አማን ኢትዮጵያን አሉት። ያኔ ግን ኒገር ነኝ ማለት እንደ ትልቅ ነገር ነበረ፣ እንደ ጥቁር ነኝ እንደማለት ነበረ። አሁን ኒገር አሜሪካን ሀገር ስድብ ነው። እሺ እኔ በእንግሊዝኛ ለመናገር ይፈቀድልኝ። ፓን አፍሪካኒዝም በአማርኛ ተናገር አላውቅም፣ ግን እንደሱ ናግና ውይይቱን በአማርኛ እናደርገዋለን። African countries, if you take the Democratic Republic of Congo, it has minerals worth $24 trillion, which is bigger than the American GDP. The combined wealth of Africa is more than the combined wealth of the North America and Europe in terms of minerals, in terms of agricultural resources, in terms of land resources, in terms of water resources, flora and fauna, and of course the very young population we have in Africa. Next. So today I'm going to focus on what is Pan-Africanism, what can the African Union or whatever unity of Africa can do, and what are the challenges that we're facing in terms of getting where we should be getting. Next. Next. Okay. The challenge we have in the African continent today is not only because of slavery and colonialism, but it's also because of our own leadership. The kind of leadership we have in this continent is very difficult. If you take the United Nations Charter, I've worked in the UN for a long period of time as senior policy advisor in New York and in different places. The UN Charter says, we the people of the United Nations. That's the beginning, some of the sentence that introduced the universal rights of human beings. But if you come to the African Union, it says we, the heads of state and government of Africa. It doesn't represent the African population. And therefore it's an important distinction where the citizens of this continent should be able to be represented in this. Therefore, young people like you are going to be the future of this continent, where leadership trajectories will have to change from time to time if we're going to achieve what we should be achieving. Africa today is a continent of poor people. Africa today is a continent of pandemics and epidemics. If we heard recently, we had the Ebola epidemic in Uganda. Africa today is a continent of conflicts. We have conflicts everywhere in this continent. DRC, I told you, is the richest country in the world, literally, but it's the poorest in terms of human development. Central African Republic. We have conflicts in the Sahel, where Boko Haram and other insurgents are creating lots of conflicts. We have Mozambique. And then when you go up to the northern part, we have conflicts in northern Uganda. We have conflicts in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan. Sudan in 4 fronts. We have Darfur, we have Kordofan, Blue Nile, and the Abyei regions. South Sudan, the newest nation in the world, is still under conflict. And therefore our progress emanates from this trajectories, and this is going to be a role as young people who are going to lead the transformation of Africa. So basically, the help of transformational change that I'm thinking are the kind of relationships we have between strategy, organization, and the kind of campaigning and advocacy we're going to have in terms of developing some kind of holistic message where the African people can raise up and develop themselves. Look at 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, before colonialism, before the issue of slavery 500 years ago, African countries didn't have governments, African countries didn't have donors, African countries didn't have NGOs. So how did the African population survive without international aid? How did communities survive without the kind of government that should be undertaking development? So technically, the relevance of governments and international aid is zero, even today. So African communities can survive in spite of the fact that Africans have been taken as slaves to develop the United States and Europe, in spite of the fact that African countries have been colonized and the resources have been plundered, in spite of the fact that the resources are still being plundered. Today in DRC, Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, diamonds are being looted out by multinational corporations using surrogate companies from Lebanon and other places. Africa loses something like $158 billion a year, and comparing that to the amount of aid flows that go into the continent, is not even 1/3 of the amount that's going out. Illicit financial flows, the flows of minerals, flora and fauna, are the biggest asset that we're losing. So, in terms of the statement of challenge, next. We'll go very fast with the challenge now. Next. Yeah, the first challenge is the colonial legacy, where African countries have borders that do not have any significance in terms of the cultural, organizational makeup of populations. And therefore, these borders have become points of contention for wars between South Sudan and Sudan, between Eritrea and Ethiopia, for example. These are recent examples where we have skirmishes that have become very difficult to solve. Next. And then we have the social dimensions. Africa now hosts the largest number of IDPs and refugees. Internally displaced people are in millions. In 2005, I went to review the Darfur conflict for the UN Security Council, and there were 2 million people in just one internally displaced camp. These are people who've been displaced in their own land. This is a very rich land that can produce food, that can produce livelihood resources for the people. But the problem has been that we have now millions of refugees who have nothing to eat and basically surviving on materials that they can get anywhere from host communities that are hosting. Because of Syria, because of Ukraine, now the amount of funding that's coming to Africa for refugees and displaced peoples is literally nil. I'm a trustee of an organization called Africa Humanitarian Action. We've supported about 22 million refugees so far in Africa. Today we find ourselves in a very serious tragedy because the funding that used to come for supporting the refugees and IDPs in Africa is now going into Ukraine. The UN totally is completely bankrupt. UNHCR has said very clearly that by December 2022, last month, if they don't get $700 million, they're going to stop supplying refugees in Africa. So these are the challenges you're going to face when you're going to look into Pan-Africanism. These are the challenges you're going to look into. Pan-Africanism is not just a question of conference and media outlets. It's a question of how we transform this continent. Pan-Africanism is an issue that started with what you call Ethiopianism. Because of the long history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the South African activists called it Ethiopianism to begin with. Pan-Africanism will become very popular in North America because this included all the diaspora. When we talk about that diaspora, we're not talking about the current diaspora like Mulgeta Katama, who has been in the United States for a long period of time. Now he's getting old, so he's coming here for us to take care of him. But when you talk about diaspora, we're talking about the slaves that were taken from Africa 500 years ago. The slaves that developed the United States, the slaves that developed Europe. And so Pan-Africanism represents the entirety of all people of African origin. And when we talk about Pan-Africanism, so far what has been the issue is it has been a lot of literature written by Du Bois and other phenomenal people who've been very active in this area. But Pan-Africanism became an operational concept when Mulgeta Katama's father, Gash Katama, our former foreign minister, the late Katama Ifru, started the founding of the Organization of African Unity. The brief history of that is when Africans wanted to get together, there were two groups, what you call the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group. Both of them wanted to establish an African Union of their own. Eventually, it was the effort of his father, Katama Ifru, who brought these two together in Addis Ababa and founded the Organization of African Unity. The key area at that time was the invitation of President Sekou Toure of Kenya at that time to come here and to be able to attend the naval graduation ceremony in Massawa with Emperor Haile Selassie. He has been key in helping Emperor Haile Selassie, and of course the groundwork has been done by Foreign Minister Katamaiko. That is probably the most operational and relevant issue that we've seen so far on Pan-Africanism. Today we have the African Union because of the Organization of African Unity. Franc-Afrique is a concept. If you go to Al Jazeera and Google Franc-Afrique, you will see 3 episodes of how France exploited Africa for a long period of time. You see French ministers, former ministers, talking on how they were undertaking military coups and counter coups in this continent. You see in this video, it's fascinating how these people were honest enough to say, we were financing coup d'etats, we were financing the change of regimes in Africa because if they are not good for France, then we don't want them. They have been financing guerrilla forces. All guerrilla forces that you find in Africa, Boko Haram or any other guerrilla force that has been going on, has been financed by European countries, by different security organizations of different developed nations. This is with the intent of having full control of the resources of Africa and of course the political significance of Africa. There are 54 countries in this continent, and 54 countries voting in the United Nations means a lot for everybody. You've seen recently on the Ukraine crisis where African countries didn't vote to condemn Russia. So that has become an important element where now the United States, Russia, China are courting Africa so that they can get their votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations. Well, I think we'll jump this because it's going to be a long one. You'll get a copy of this presentation. It's online, therefore some of the biggest problems and challenges that we faced in Africa in the 1980s have been what we call structural adjustment programs by the International Monetary Fund and by the World Bank. And these 2 organizations started what we call structural adjustment programs. These structural adjustment programs literally cleaned up entirely the social services and social dimensions of development in the African continent. 41 military coup d'etats resulted as a result of this because people had nothing to eat. If basic commodities like bread, their price increased, then people revolt. In Egypt, the price of bread and the size of bread has been changing in 50 years because no government can survive by changing that. But in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, the IMF and World Bank played their own games. That's why now they have focused more on poverty, which was the agenda of the United Nations Development Program. And therefore, the coup d'etats that we have in Africa, we have about more than 200 coup d'etats in Africa in the recent history since independence. About 120 of them were very successful coup d'etats, which means they resulted in regime change. But when we have military coups, there are 3 things that you must know. 1, military coups happen because society is not happy with the current government. Number 2, the military becomes much worse than the current government. And number 3, it will be very difficult to get rid of them. The case in Sudan today that we see with President Al-Burhan, who is the general, who has been promising to give back power to the people, he refused. He brought Abdullah Hamdok, I don't know, some of you might know him. He lived for about 30 years here in Ethiopia, working for the United Economic Commission for Africa. I met Abdullah for the first time in Zimbabwe when I was working for the United Nations, some 3 decades back, 4 decades back. He was working for the ILO, and then he was a resident of Addis Ababa. And then when a prime minister was required to work with the military, a group of elite academics recommended Abdullah Hamdok to go there, and the people of Sudan, the doctors committee, the university professors, and of course the elite in Sudan accepted him. But finally they put him in jail. And therefore military coups are bad examples of development. In Ethiopia, the 17 years of the military term, besides killing almost 2 million people, 1 million people died in what you call red terror and white terror. Another 1 million died because of starvation. In 1984, there was a big famine in Africa, in Ethiopia. This, of course, it was across Africa, but the Ethiopian case was bad. At that time, I was working as an official of the Red Cross, and we've seen these people dying, over 1 million people. These are the kind of results you find in a military government. Next. Well, I've talked about the DRC well, so you'll read it next, later on. This engagement, now we have a new phenomenon. Today, we've been talking about slavery and colonialism, but what is the role of China in Africa now? This is, I think, a very important concept that we need to put in. On the positive side, China has undertaken major restructuring of the investment in infrastructure. In Ethiopia, we built over 100,000 kilometers of roads. We're building something like 5,000 railways, 20 dams, more than 250,000 high-tension transmission lines, industrial parks, over 50 universities, and of course the cities have grown beyond what you can think. Addis Ababa is now different from what it was 20 years ago. So this country and the phenomenal GDP growth that we've seen in Ethiopia, in 2020, Financial Times, which is a very conservative newspaper, said that Ethiopia has grown between 2010 and 2020 as the fastest country in GDP growth in the world. Normally, Financial Times is very conservative. China's role in this growth has been phenomenal. But we can also see some of the impediments that we look into China, where the Western press are saying it is there to exploit African resources, because African minerals now are the only alternative that exists to Chinese source of minerals. China is the biggest source of minerals for the world today. Now Africa is replacing it, and therefore China wants to control these resources. And therefore, the negative issues that you hear from China and the positive things that we see are things that we need to balance in your own discussions. What are the challenges that we face with Chinese Forum for Africa and China, what we call the FOCAC? They have now invested over $60 billion in this continent. And therefore, it's important to look in the new trajectories where the emerging new Cold War, because of Ukraine, is creating a new multilateral source of power. Today, during the Cold War, we had the Soviet Union and the United States. After the Cold War, it was the United States which was a unipolar leader in this world. Now China, Russia, and the United States are emerging as a multipolar centers of power. So where does Africa play its game? What kind of relationships do you need with these big powers? And how do we do our diplomatic savoir-faire with these major institutions? Let's go. We can pass that. Yeah, we can pass that. Yeah, Pan-Africanism. I see here Pan-Africanism, እንቅስቃሴ አፍሪካ ኢኮኖሚ፣ ፖለቲካ፣ ማህበራዊ ፋይዳ ይላል እና ምንድን ነው Pan-Africanism? What do we do with Pan-Africanism? I think this is a very important issue. You know, in 2000, I think it's about 22 years ago, I had the team to go to Sudan because they had a crisis in managing their finance, their national accounts. And we suggested they should have different kind of exchange rates. It's the same problem we have in Ethiopia today. The Sudanese exchange rate was completely bad, and therefore black market became so phenomenal that the official market was not functioning. This is exactly what's happening today in Ethiopia. If you go to the shops, they are full of goods and services. There is no problem in Addis. But we complain about foreign currency, the lack of foreign currency. Where are these goods and services coming into this country? Somebody has to find out. I don't think the government can find out because they don't want to. But the question of illicit financial flows, the question of contraband trade has overtaken the formal economy in this country. So in Sudan, basically what we did is we said we should have different kinds of exchange rates for different transactions. For example, money coming from the diaspora has to be at the black market rate, because an old woman getting some $100 from her son or her daughter from abroad, it doesn't make a dent in the national economy, but it makes a lot of sense for her to get the money that she deserves at the black market rate. So we had about 6 exchange rates for them. I've suggested to our National Bank people here to do the same thing. Look at coffee exporters in this country. What is the price of 1 kilo coffee? 100 kilo bunna sint no waga? Manu mekal shemito meksal? Sint yona? 400. So 100 kilo bunna 400 ብር ነው። which የሚሸጠው አሱ መርካቶ ነው ወይ ዶ ከሲዳሞ ነው የሚገዛው። እና አሁን 1 ኪሎ ቡና ውጭ ሀገር የሚሸጠው $1 ነው። አንድ ነጋዴ በ400 እና 500 ብር ከኛ ሀገር ገዝቶ ኤክስፖርት አድርጎ 50 ብር ነው የሚያገኘው። እና 450 ብር 350 ብር ሉዝ እያደረገ ነው ማለት ነው የሚሸጠው። የትኛው ነጋዴ ነው እንደዚህ ሉዝ እያደረገ የሚሸጠው? ስለዚህ ቡና ኤክስፖርት ማድረግ አንችልም። ምን ተደረገኛ ጋር ናሽናል ባንክ ኦኬ ቡና ኤክስፖርተሮች ኤክስፖርት አድርጉና ዶላሩን ለእናንተ ለራሳችሁ ሰዱ አላቸው። እነሱ በዶላሩ ሌላ ነገር አመጡና ይቸበችቡታል ህዝቡ። እና እንደዚህ አይነት ነገሮች በጣም ዲፊከልት ናቸው ማኔጅ ነው ማድረግ። ለምንድን ነው ለቡና ኤክስፖርት ብቻ የተወሰነ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬት ማናረገው? ለምሳሌ ቡና ኤክስፖርት ለሚያደርጉ ሰዎች የታወቀ ነው። ኤክስፖርቱ በኮንቴይነር ነው የሚሄደው፣ ገንዘቡ ሌተር ኦፍ ክሬዲት ነው የሚመጣው። ስለዚህ ለእነሱ $1 ምንዛሬ 500 ብር እናደርግላቸዋለን። ይሄ ፓራሌል ኤክስቼንጅ ሬትስ ይባላል። እነ ኮሎምቢያ፣ ብራዚል have used it during the pandemic. But the only thing is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have to accept this. And they have to monitor it very closely because it can be abused. So in Sudan, I started this story because I went to a university to interview one of the professor of economics to ask him the challenge of the Sudanese economy. Well, when I met him, he said, I know you have seen you. You have been giving lectures left and right, and I know you work in the UN. So you want to know about the Sudanese economy? I said, yes. You know when you go for your eyeglass, to change your eyeglass, they tell you to see on the wall. You have this convoluted E's and things like that you read. For those of you who have changed glass, you know it. So the guy went to the doctor and he told him to look at the wall, and he said, where is the wall? So he said, this is the Sudanese economy. But this applies to the entire African continent. Even in countries like, I have served as head of the UN in Nigeria for 3 years. In Nigeria, you literally smell money in the air. There is plenty of money, but you see a lot of poverty. Almost 60% of the Nigerian population is urbanized. And the kind of poverty that you see in that continent is literally, your gut feeling just goes down. That rich country, which gets something like $20 billion from oil resources every year, they get $19 billion from telecom royalties, and yet it's only very few people who take the money. So these are the challenge with Pan-Africanism that you're going to see. It's not a question of having the literature. It's not the question of having or being an African in the first place, because today, under globalization, we are global citizens. We're not just African citizens, Ethiopian citizens, Oromo, Tigray, or Gurage, or anything. We are global citizens. And as global citizens, how do we project African citizens so that they can have sustainable livelihoods? That's the main question. And therefore in Pan-Africanism, you're going to look into this. Let's run through very fast. Let's go. Next. Yeah, Ethiopianism, I mentioned it earlier because Ethiopianism came because I know some people don't like it, but Emperor Menelik won the war against the Italians, and we're trying to revise history in this country. History is a lesson that we all need to learn because that's which tells us where we came from. So Adwa is the source of all kinds of Pan-Africanism. When we defeated the Italians in Adwa, and before that, of course, Rasalula, Emperor Johannes have defeated the Italians, have defeated the Dervishes, have defeated the Mahadis, and this is a long history of bravery that we see within the Ethiopian nation. The problem is we're trying to revise that history. We're trying to say Ethiopia has only a history of 100 years or 50 years or probably sometimes 4 years only, depending on who is talking. So Adwa is the basis of our Pan-African thinking because the black race could win the white race. This was the kind of thinking at that time because the white race was making us slaves. That kind of racism, you already see it today in the United States, in Europe. Even in Ukraine, when the war started, African students were not allowed to go on the train. The priority was given to the white people who were going to Europe. Europeans didn't allow the African students who were studying in Ukrainian universities to go away from the war. Probably that's one reason Africans are not supporting the kind of Ukrainian resolution that you have in the United Nations. Next. Okay, let's, this is the quote that always comes. ኢትዮጵያ እጆቿን ወደ ሰማይ ዘረጋለች የሚል ነገር አለ። ግን ባይብል ላይ ስታነቡት በመጀመሪያው እሱ አለ። ቀጥሎ ግን ሎላ ነው የሚመጡት ግን ከግብፅ ነው ይላል እና እሷን ኮታ እንናገራትም የመጀመሪያውን ብቻ ነው የምንናገረው እና check your Bible verses. Next. So, how do we talk about some pointers towards peace and transformation in this continent? Yeah, you can run it continuously now as I speak. I think the major issue in creating livelihood security in this continent is first to have peace and then to have responsible governance. As I said, we have enough resources in this continent to feed our own population. We're losing more money to international financial institutions and banks, and literally the Western countries are robbing this continent. And whoever can rob, of course, if you find money hanging around somewhere, you always take it, and that's exactly what's happening. Our leaders are also cooperating with these people. If you have Equatorial Guinea, which is a tiny state of 800,000 people, but has plenty of money. The son of the president, he has a yacht worth $100 billion. He has this fast cars worth many millions. So the American government nationalized the entire property, saying it's stolen property from Africa. So we are in a new world where our leaders cannot loot our continent. They cannot go and put money in the Western banks anymore. The new destination, of course, is Turkey and China because they cannot go to Europe, the United States, Swiss banks. These are regulated now by international jurisdictions which prevent them from having illicit financial flows. And therefore it's very important to look into how do we develop this continent. I think this is a simple issue. Number one, we have to use our resources properly. Number two, we have to improve the governance in this continent. Number three, we have to get rid of these regimes that are literally preventing the African countries from developing themselves. Look at Equatorial Guinea I mentioned. Nguema have been there for almost 50 years now as president, 40-something years. These are gerontocrats running this continent. Museveni has been there for more than 30 years. Our neighbor Eritrea has the same issue. Bashir in Sudan has been over 30 years, 3 decades. I mean, it's boring to be working in the same place for 30 years. I don't know why these people don't even think of changing their mindset, of doing something better in their life. Eventually, they end up all in the grave or in the prison. These are the kind of destinations we are. But this trend has to change. The second problem we have is when we talk about democracy in Africa, we talk about elections. But who do we elect? What is the kind of political culture that exists within this continent? What are the indigenous institutions like the Gada system, for example, in Oromia? A very developed cultural system that has been using for self-governing for a long period of time in this continent. In the northern Ethiopia, we have Mahbers, Baitos, and different kind of institutions. In 1995, we did a study for the European Union on civil society organizations, indigenous civil society organizations in Ethiopia. We documented 199,000 civil society organizations that have leadership, that elect their leadership, that run finance, that have treasuries, that have secretaries, and that change their leadership depending on their performance. But when it comes to democracy, it's just elections. And of course, during elections, you have the election board. The election board certifies one government 100%, 98% win. This is not democracy. Of course, elections are an important cornerstone of democracy. But democracy is about developing a political culture. Democracy is about creating a space for every citizen to be able to participate and contest political agenda in the country. That doesn't exist in Africa. We need to look into that. Young people are losing their lives. You've seen in Sudan now, for 3 years, young people have been killed on demonstrations every day. In Ethiopia, young people died to bring this transformation. Where are we heading? These are the issues that we need to talk about in Africa. South Africa is the same thing. ANC has been in power for almost 3 decades. Don't you have any other party that can lead South Africa? Most people in South Africa today, their life was much better during apartheid than under ANC.